Have you ever wondered what it was like to be completely forgotten by history? To live a life so unremarkable that centuries later, no one would even remember your name? Well, tonight we're diving deep into the tragic existence of someone who embodied that exact fate. A man whose story represents thousands of others just like him during the medieval period. Meet Thomas the Ale-Soaked. That wasn't his real surname, of course, but it's what the villagers called him behind his back, and sometimes to his face. Thomas lived in a small English village during the 14th century, and his entire world revolved around one simple building that stood at the heart of his community: the tavern. But this isn't just Thomas's story. This is the story of what it meant to be a medieval tavern drunk, when alcohol wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. When the line between medicine and poison was thinner than the ale they served, and when society had a very different relationship with those who couldn't control their drinking. So settle in, because we're about to explore the darkest corners of medieval tavern culture, where the ale flowed freely, but hope was always in short supply. Let me paint you a picture of Thomas's world. It's the year 1342, and England is still reeling from the devastating effects of the Great Famine that struck decades earlier. The Black Death hasn't arrived yet, but life expectancy is brutal. Most people are dead by 40. The lucky ones make it to 50. Thomas wakes up every morning on a pile of straw in the corner of the Red Lion Tavern. The proprietor, a woman named Margaret Brewster, allows him to sleep there in exchange for odd jobs around the establishment. Sweeping rushes from the floor, emptying chamber pots, cleaning up after the more violent drunks who frequent the place after dark. But Thomas wasn't always this way. 20 years earlier, he had been a successful miller's apprentice in the same village. He had prospects. There was even talk of him marrying Sarah, the baker's daughter. She had red hair that caught the sunlight just right, and when she laughed, Thomas felt like the world made sense. Then came the year the rains wouldn't stop. The grain rotted in the fields. The mill wheel turned uselessly because there was nothing left to grind. Thomas lost his position, his savings, and eventually Sarah too. She married the blacksmith's son instead, someone who could still put food on the table. That's when Thomas discovered that ale could make the hunger pangs disappear, at least temporarily. And more importantly, it could make the memories fade. The memory of Sarah's laugh. The memory of having purpose. The memory of being someone who mattered. Medieval ale wasn't like the beer we know today. It was weaker, usually around 2 to 3% alcohol, but it was also safer to drink than water. Most water sources were contaminated with waste and disease. Ale went through a brewing process that killed dangerous bacteria, so everyone drank it. Children, adults, clergy members, nobles. It was liquid bread, liquid safety, liquid life. But for people like Thomas, it became liquid escape. The Red Lion wasn't just a tavern. It was the social center of the village, the place where news was shared, business was conducted, and justice was sometimes dispensed. Medieval taverns served multiple functions that we've since divided among different institutions. They were hotels, restaurants, meeting halls, and sometimes even courtrooms. Margaret Brewster ran her establishment with an iron fist wrapped in a motherly smile. She knew every regular customer's story, their debts, their family troubles, their drinking patterns. She could tell when someone was about to cause trouble before they even realized it themselves. And she knew that Thomas, despite his obvious problems, was essentially harmless. Thomas had developed what the villagers called the tavern shuffle, a particular way of walking that kept him upright even when the ale had done its worst damage to his balance. He would place one hand against the wall and slide it along as he moved, never lifting his feet too high off the ground. It was a skill born of necessity and years of practice. Most mornings, Thomas would start his day by helping Margaret prepare for the evening's customers. Medieval taverns operated on a different schedule than modern bars. They served ale throughout the day, but the real business happened after the working day ended. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants and laborers would gather to drink, eat, gossip, and sometimes settle disputes. Thomas had become invisible to most of these people. They looked through him rather than at him. He was furniture, part of the tavern's atmosphere, but not really a person worth acknowledging. This invisibility had its advantages. People said things in front of Thomas they would never say in front of someone they considered their social equal. He learned about affairs, business deals, family feuds, and political opinions. Thomas became a repository of village secrets, though he was usually too drunk to remember them clearly, or too marginalized for anyone to worry about what he might repeat. But sometimes, late at night, when the other customers had stumbled home to their wives and children, Thomas would sit by the dying fire and Margaret would join him. She would bring him a bowl of pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables and grains she had available, and for a few minutes, Thomas would remember what it felt like to be treated like a human being. Margaret never judged him directly, but she understood his story because she had seen it play out dozens of times before. Medieval life was precarious. One bad harvest, one injury, one stroke of bad luck could send anyone spiraling downward. The difference between respectability and destitution was often measured in months, not years. Thomas's daily routine had crystallized into a pattern that rarely varied. He would wake up around dawn, help Margaret with morning preparations, earn enough ale to keep the shakes at bay, spend the afternoon in a hazy stupor, become more social and talkative as evening customers arrived, and then drink himself into unconsciousness before starting the cycle again the next day. Medieval society had no concept of alcoholism as a disease. They understood that some people drank too much, but they generally viewed it as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. The church preached temperance, but even priests and monks were known to indulge heavily in wine and ale. The line between acceptable drinking and problematic drinking was blurry and constantly shifting. Thomas existed in this grey area, tolerated but not respected, pitied but not helped. He had become what medieval people called a masterless man, someone without a clear place in the social hierarchy, without a trade guild, without family ties that could provide support and structure. In medieval England, your identity was largely determined by your relationships. You were someone's son, someone's apprentice, someone's tenant, someone's husband. Thomas had lost all of these connections one by one until he was simply Thomas the Ale-Soaked, a cautionary tale that parents used to warn their children about the dangers of drink. But Thomas's story was far from unique. Every village had at least one person like him, usually more. Medieval records show that tavern drunks were a recognized social category, common enough that laws were written specifically to address their behavior. They could be fined for public drunkenness, banned from taverns for disorderly conduct, or even put in the stocks for repeated offences. Yet somehow, Thomas had managed to avoid the worst legal consequences of his lifestyle. Perhaps because Margaret protected him, or perhaps because he had perfected the art of being drunk without being disruptive. He rarely fought, never stole, and usually kept his misery to himself. The ale that sustained Thomas was produced right in Margaret's tavern. Medieval brewing was typically women's work, and alewives like Margaret were skilled craftspeople who understood the complex process of turning grain into alcohol. They malted barley by soaking it in water until it sprouted, then dried it over fires. The malted grain was mixed with hot water to create a sweet liquid called wort, which was then fermented with yeast. The entire process took about a week, and the resulting ale had to be consumed quickly before it spoiled. There were no preservatives, no refrigeration, no way to keep ale fresh for extended periods. This meant that medieval taverns operated on a constant cycle of brewing, selling, and brewing again. Thomas had learned to recognize the subtle differences between fresh ale and ale that was beginning to turn. He could tell by the smell, the colour, the way the foam behaved when Margaret poured it into wooden cups. It was knowledge born of desperate necessity, because bad ale could make you violently sick, and when you lived on the edge of survival like Thomas did, even a few days of illness could be catastrophic. The medieval tavern existed in a complex relationship with both church and state authorities. Religious leaders preached against the sins of drunkenness and gluttony, but they also recognized that taverns served important social functions. Local governments tried to regulate ale quality and pricing, but they also collected taxes from tavern operators and understood that these establishments helped maintain social order by giving people a place to gather and release tension. Thomas had witnessed this delicate balance firsthand. He had seen local officials arrive to inspect Margaret's ale, testing its strength and quality, sometimes shutting down operations if they found violations. He had watched as travelling priests delivered sermons about temperance to tavern customers, who nodded along while continuing to drink. And he had observed the unspoken understanding that as long as the drinking didn't lead to serious violence or property damage, authorities would generally look the other way. Medieval taverns operated under a complex system of regulation that Thomas had learned to navigate through years of observation. Each tavern was required to display an ale stake, a long pole with a bush or other marker that indicated fresh ale was available. When Margaret had a new batch ready, she would hang out this sign, and word would spread through the village that the Red Lion was serving. But Thomas knew the real signals. He could tell by the way Margaret moved around her brewing area, by the particular smell that drifted from the large wooden vats, by the number of times she tested the ale with her finger throughout the day. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict exactly when the first cups would be ready. The pricing of ale was strictly controlled by local authorities through something called the assize of ale. Officials would set prices based on grain costs, and tavern keepers like Margaret could face heavy fines if they charged more than the established rate. Thomas had seen inspectors arrive unannounced, demanding to taste the ale and check the measurements Margaret used when serving customers. These inspections terrified him, not because he had done anything wrong, but because disruptions to the tavern's routine meant disruptions to his own precarious existence. If Margaret was fined heavily or temporarily shut down, Thomas would lose both his shelter and his access to the ale that had become as essential to him as breathing. Medieval ale came in different strengths and qualities. The strongest was called double ale, brewed with extra grain and allowed to ferment longer. This was expensive and usually reserved for special occasions or wealthy customers. Then came single ale, the everyday drink that most people consumed. Finally, there was small ale, weak and watery, often given to children and labourers. Thomas had long since lost the ability to afford double ale, but Margaret would sometimes allow him to finish the dregs left in cups by departing customers. He wasn't proud of this practice, but pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Each drop of stronger ale meant a few more minutes of relief from the constant anxiety that gnawed at his chest like a living thing. The tavern's clientele created a complex social ecosystem that Thomas observed from his peripheral position. There were the regular working men who came every evening after completing their daily labour. Farmers with dirt still under their fingernails, carpenters with wood shavings in their hair, merchants with ink stains on their fingers from keeping ledgers. These men represented the backbone of medieval village society. They had families, responsibilities, social standing. They drank to relax, to socialize, to transition from the working day to the domestic evening. Their drinking had boundaries, structure, purpose beyond mere escape. Then there were the occasional visitors, traveling merchants, pilgrims heading to distant shrines, messengers carrying news between villages. These strangers brought stories from the outside world, tales of distant places and different customs. Thomas would position himself where he could overhear their conversations, living vicariously through their adventures. Sometimes these travelers would take pity on him and buy him an ale, perhaps recognizing something of themselves in his weathered face, or perhaps simply acknowledging the universal human capacity for falling from grace. Thomas treasured these moments of unexpected kindness, storing them away like precious coins to be remembered during his darkest hours. The tavern also attracted what Margaret called the edge dwellers, people like Thomas who existed on the margins of respectable society. There was old Willem, a former soldier who had lost his leg in some forgotten conflict and now survived by telling increasingly embellished war stories in exchange for drinks. There was Bess the Wanderer, a woman whose husband had died years earlier and who now moved from village to village, sometimes working as a seamstress, sometimes begging, always drinking. These people formed an unofficial community of the dispossessed. They understood each other's pain without needing to discuss it explicitly. They shared information about which taverns were most tolerant, which officials were most likely to show mercy, which seasonal work might be available for people with questionable reputations. Thomas had learned that medieval society, despite its rigid hierarchies and moral strictures, had developed informal networks of survival for people who had fallen through the cracks. It wasn't charity in any organized sense, but rather a recognition that maintaining complete social order required allowing space for those who couldn't or wouldn't conform to normal expectations. The church's relationship with drinking was particularly complicated in Thomas's world. Officially, the clergy preached moderation and condemned drunkenness as a sin. But wine was central to Christian ritual, and many monasteries were major producers of alcoholic beverages. Monks and priests were often among the most skilled brewers and vintners in their communities. Thomas had observed visiting priests who drank as heavily as any layman, justifying their behavior with complex theological arguments about the difference between enjoying God's gifts and abusing them. He had listened to sermons about temperance delivered by clerics whose breath smelled strongly of wine. These contradictions didn't anger him. They simply reinforced his understanding that hypocrisy was as universal as suffering. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created corresponding patterns in tavern culture. During harvest time, when everyone worked from dawn to dusk gathering crops, the tavern would be quieter during evening hours. People were too exhausted for extended drinking sessions. But once the harvest was complete, there would be celebration. Harvest ales, stronger and more festive than the daily offerings, would flow freely as the community marked another successful growing season. Winter brought different challenges and different drinking patterns. With less outdoor work available, men had more time to spend in the tavern. But they also had less money, as the cash from harvest sales gradually dwindled through the cold months. Thomas learned to expect hungrier times during winter, when even Margaret's charity would be stretched thin. Spring brought hope and desperation in equal measure. Hope because the cycle of planting and growing would begin again. Desperation because winter food stores were running low and the new harvest was still months away. Thomas had lived through enough of these cycles to understand that his own survival depended on reading these seasonal moods correctly. The tavern served as an informal courthouse for minor disputes. Thomas had witnessed countless arguments settled over ale rather than through official legal proceedings. Property disputes, marriage problems, business disagreements, all could be resolved through the mediation of respected community members gathered around Margaret's tables. These informal justice sessions fascinated Thomas because they revealed how medieval communities actually functioned beneath the official structures of lord and king and church. Real power often lay with people who had earned respect through their judgment, their fairness, their ability to find solutions that everyone could live with. Margaret herself often served as an unofficial magistrate in these proceedings. Her tavern was neutral ground. Her ale loosened tongues and tempers equally, and her long experience dealing with human nature in all its forms made her a trusted arbiter. Thomas had seen her diffuse potentially violent confrontations with a few well-chosen words and strategically place drinks. But Thomas also witnessed the darker side of tavern justice. Sometimes the ale that loosened tongues also inflamed tempers beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. He had seen friendships destroyed over perceived slights, business partnerships dissolved in drunken rage, and family feuds that would last for generations, born from misunderstandings that escalated in the heat of alcoholic passion. Violence in medieval taverns was common enough that most establishments had developed protocols for dealing with it. Margaret kept a heavy wooden club behind the bar, not because she was particularly violent, but because sometimes the threat of force was necessary to maintain order. Thomas had learned to recognize the signs of approaching trouble and position himself safely away from potential conflict. The weapons that men carried added another layer of danger to tavern disputes. Most adult males carried knives as tools for eating and working, but these same implements could become deadly weapons when wielded by drunk and angry hands. Thomas had seen too many arguments escalate from words to bloodshed in the space of a few heartbeats. Yet somehow, most evenings at the Red Lion passed peacefully. Men would drink their ale, share their stories, complain about their wives or their work or the weather, and then stumble home to repeat the cycle the next day. The violence when it occurred was shocking precisely because it emerged from this routine of mundane social interaction. Thomas's position as a permanent fixture in the tavern gave him a unique perspective on the long-term patterns of village life. He watched children grow into adults, saw marriages form and dissolve, observed the rise and fall of family fortunes. He became an unofficial chronicler of ordinary lives, though his chronicles existed only in his alcohol-clouded memory. He remembered when young Jack the Cooper had been an apprentice, eager and ambitious, full of plans for expanding his master's business. Now Jack was Master Cooper himself, but the ambition had been worn away by years of routine work and family responsibilities. Jack still came to the tavern, but he drank with the weariness of a man who had learned that life rarely matched the dreams of youth. Thomas saw his own story reflected in dozens of similar trajectories. Men who had started with hope and ended with resignation. Women who had married with love and learned to settle for survival. Children who had played with joy and grown into adults who worked with grim determination. But he also witnessed moments of genuine happiness that reminded him why people continued to struggle against the odds. Wedding celebrations that filled the tavern with laughter and dancing. The birth announcements that prompted rounds of drinks for everyone present. The successful completion of difficult projects that gave men reason to feel proud of their skills and accomplishments. These celebrations were particularly painful for Thomas because they highlighted everything he had lost. Yet they also provided a kind of vicarious joy that helped sustain him through his darkest periods. He had learned to find meaning in other people's happiness, to feel connected to the community even from its margins. The medieval understanding of what we would call mental health was primitive at best, and Thomas embodied many of the symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as depression and anxiety disorders. But in his time, these conditions were explained through a complex mixture of religious doctrine, folk wisdom, and crude medical theory. Medieval physicians believed that human personality and health were governed by 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess of black bile was thought to cause melancholy, which was the closest medieval concept to what we now understand as depression. Thomas's constant sadness and his tendency to drink alone would have been seen as clear evidence of a melancholic temperament. The Church offered its own explanations for Thomas's condition. Some priests would have argued that his suffering was divine punishment for past sins, while others might have suggested it was a test of faith that could lead to spiritual growth. A few progressive clerics even proposed that excessive drinking was itself a form of slow suicide, which was considered one of the gravest sins against God's will. But Margaret had her own theory about Thomas's condition, one born from years of observing human behavior rather than studying ancient texts. She believed that some people were simply born with hearts that felt too much, and that the world had a way of breaking these sensitive souls more easily than others. It wasn't a scientific explanation, but it contained more practical wisdom than most of the official theories of her time. Thomas's daily consumption of ale had reached levels that would have killed a modern person within months. But medieval ale was weaker than contemporary beer, and Thomas had built up a tolerance over years of gradual increase. His body had adapted to function in a state of constant mild intoxication, though the long-term damage was becoming increasingly visible to those who knew how to look. His hands shook constantly now, not just in the mornings, but throughout the day. His skin had taken on a yellowish pallor that Margaret recognized as a sign of liver damage, though she didn't know the medical term for it. His eyes, once a clear blue that Sarah, the baker's daughter, had admired, had become bloodshot and watery. Most telling of all, he had developed what the villagers called the drinker's belly, a distended abdomen that made him look pregnant despite his otherwise wasted frame. The progression of Thomas's physical decline had been so gradual that he barely noticed it himself. Each morning brought slightly more pain, slightly less energy, slightly greater difficulty concentrating on simple tasks. But the ale still provided relief, and that was all that mattered to someone living one day at a time. Margaret had tried several times over the years to convince Thomas to reduce his drinking, but these conversations always ended the same way. Thomas would become agitated, sometimes angry, and would disappear from the tavern for days at a time. When he returned, he would be in worse condition than before, having spent his absence drinking whatever rotgut ale he could find in less reputable establishments. These disappearances terrified Margaret more than she cared to admit. Thomas had become part of the fabric of her daily life, and his absence left a hole that surprised her with its depth. She had grown fond of him in the way one grows fond of a wounded animal that refuses to heal but continues to trust your kindness. During one particularly long absence, Margaret had asked around the village, trying to discover where Thomas might be staying. What she learned disturbed her deeply. There were other taverns, places that operated on the very edges of legality, where desperate people could drink themselves to death without anyone asking questions or trying to intervene. These establishments were run by people who had abandoned any pretense of serving their community. They existed solely to extract the last few coins from individuals who had already lost everything else. The ale was often adulterated with dangerous substances to increase its potency, and the proprietors showed no concern for their customers' well-being beyond their ability to continue paying. When Thomas finally returned from that particular disappearance, he was in such poor condition that Margaret seriously considered refusing to serve him any more ale. His clothes were filthy and torn, his speech was slurred even when he hadn't been drinking, and he had developed a persistent cough that produced specks of blood. But she also knew that cutting him off completely would simply drive him back to those predatory establishments, where he might not survive another visit. This dilemma highlighted one of the central contradictions of medieval tavern culture. Establishments like Margaret's Red Lion served important social functions and operated according to informal codes of responsibility toward their regular customers. But they also enabled and profited from destructive drinking patterns that they were powerless to truly address. The village priest, Father Benedict, had spoken with Margaret several times about Thomas's situation. The priest was a practical man who understood that pure moral condemnation rarely helped anyone, but he also felt obligated to address what he saw as a spiritual crisis unfolding in his parish. Father Benedict had tried various approaches with Thomas over the years. He had offered prayer, confession, and even manual labor around the church in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. But Thomas seemed incapable of accepting help that required him to acknowledge his condition or make commitments about changing his behavior. The priest's most successful intervention had been simply treating Thomas with basic human dignity during their occasional encounters. Father Benedict would greet him by name, ask about his health, and sometimes share news from the outside world. These brief conversations didn't solve Thomas's problems, but they reminded him that he still existed as a person in at least one other human being's consciousness. Medieval society's approach to charity was complicated by religious doctrine, practical limitations, and deeply ingrained beliefs about personal responsibility. The Church taught that helping the poor was a Christian duty, but it also emphasized that individuals were responsible for their own spiritual condition. This created an uncomfortable tension when dealing with people like Thomas, whose poverty seemed directly connected to their moral choices. Most charitable efforts were directed toward what medieval people called the deserving poor: widows with children, disabled veterans, elderly people who had outlived their ability to work. These individuals were seen as victims of circumstances beyond their control, worthy of both sympathy and assistance. Thomas occupied a more ambiguous category. His poverty was real and his suffering was obvious, but his condition appeared to result from his own decisions. This made many villagers reluctant to offer help, fearing that their charity would simply enable more destructive behavior. Margaret's continued support of Thomas represented a different philosophy of charity, one based more on human compassion than moral judgment. She'd seen enough of life to understand that the line between virtue and vice was often thinner than people wanted to believe, and that circumstances could push anyone across that line. The seasonal celebrations that marked medieval village life created particular challenges for people like Thomas. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals, and Saints' Day celebrations all involved communal drinking and feasting. These events highlighted social bonds and community membership in ways that made Thomas's isolation even more painful. During these celebrations, the tavern would be filled with families, couples, and groups of friends sharing in collective joy. Thomas would retreat to his corner, trying to make himself invisible while simultaneously longing to be part of the festivities. The contrast between the community's happiness and his own loneliness was almost unbearable. Yet these same celebrations sometimes provided Thomas with his few moments of genuine human connection. Holiday spirits would move some villagers to include him in toasts, to share their food, or simply to acknowledge his presence with a kind word. These gestures were brief and often forgotten by the givers, but Thomas treasured them like precious gems. The economic structure of medieval village life created patterns of interdependence that Thomas had once been part of, but now observed from the outside. Farmers needed millers, millers needed farmers, craftsmen needed customers, customers needed craftsmen. Everyone had a role to play in the complex dance of survival that sustained rural communities. Thomas's exclusion from this economic network was both a cause and a consequence of his drinking. He had lost his place in the productive economy, which drove him to drink. His drinking then made him unreliable for any work that required consistency or skill, which further isolated him from economic opportunities. Margaret's decision to employ him for simple cleaning tasks was as much an act of charity as it was a business arrangement. Thomas's work was adequate, but hardly indispensable. Margaret could easily have found other workers who would have done the job better and caused fewer complications. But she understood that having some role to play, however minor, was essential for Thomas's remaining sense of self-worth. The legal status of people like Thomas was precarious in ways that reflected medieval society's struggle to deal with individuals who didn't fit neatly into established categories. He wasn't quite a beggar, since he performed some work and had a semi-permanent residence. He wasn't quite a criminal, since his drinking rarely led to serious offences. He wasn't quite insane, since he could still function at a basic level and understand consequences. This legal ambiguity provided both protection and vulnerability. Thomas was less likely to face harsh punishment for minor infractions because officials weren't quite sure how to classify him. But he was also more vulnerable to arbitrary treatment because he lacked the clear social identity that would have provided specific legal protections. Medieval courts occasionally dealt with cases involving chronic drunkards, and the legal remedies were limited and largely ineffective. Fines were useless against people who had no money. Physical punishment was counterproductive for individuals whose problems stemmed from despair rather than malice. Banishment simply moved the problem to another community without solving anything. The most common legal approach was what might be called benign neglect. As long as people like Thomas didn't cause serious trouble, authorities would generally ignore their existence. This wasn't necessarily cruel given the limited options available, but it also meant that individuals caught in downward spirals had little hope of receiving meaningful assistance. Thomas had developed an intricate understanding of village social dynamics that allowed him to navigate his precarious position with minimal conflict. He knew which villagers were likely to show kindness and which would respond with hostility to his presence. He understood the unspoken rules about when and where his presence was tolerated. Market days required particular caution, as the increased crowd and activity made some villagers more sensitive to the presence of undesirable elements. Thomas had learned to make himself scarce during these times, or to position himself where he could observe the festivities without drawing unwanted attention. Church services presented another complex social situation. Thomas occasionally attended Mass, partly from lingering religious conviction, and partly because the church was warm and dry. But he had to balance his desire for spiritual comfort against the risk of offending respectable parishioners with his appearance and the smell of ale that perpetually surrounded him. Father Benedict had never explicitly banned Thomas from services, but the priest's discomfort was obvious when Thomas appeared in church. Other parishioners would sometimes whisper complaints or move away from wherever Thomas chose to sit. These reactions reinforced Thomas's sense of being unwelcome in the very institution that preached universal love and forgiveness. The children of the village had developed their own complex relationship with Thomas. Some were frightened of him, having absorbed their parents' disapproval and suspicion. Others were curious about this strange figure who seemed to exist outside normal adult rules and responsibilities. Thomas had mixed feelings about these interactions with children. Their innocence reminded him of everything he had lost, but their occasional kindness also provided moments of unexpected joy. Sometimes a child would offer him a piece of bread or simply smile in his direction, and these gestures would sustain him through days of adult coldness and rejection. The village's other marginalized individuals formed a loose network of mutual understanding, though they rarely provided each other with material assistance. Old Willem, Bess the Wanderer, and a handful of others shared information about opportunities for casual work, warnings about particularly hostile officials, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from living on society's edges. These relationships were complicated by competition for the limited charity and casual work available to people in their situation. They might share a drink when times were good, but they could also become rivals when opportunities were scarce. Thomas had learned to navigate these relationships carefully, offering friendship when possible while protecting his own interests when necessary. The changing seasons brought different challenges and opportunities for Thomas and others in similar situations. Summer offered the possibility of sleeping outdoors when the tavern was too crowded, or when Margaret needed to limit his presence for business reasons. But summer also brought increased scrutiny from authorities who were more active in patrolling for vagrants and troublemakers. Autumn harvest time created temporary opportunities for casual labor, even for people with questionable reputations. Thomas could sometimes earn a few coins helping with grape harvests or grain processing, though his unreliability meant these opportunities were becoming increasingly rare as he aged and his condition worsened. Winter was the most dangerous season for people living on the margins. The cold could kill, food was scarce, and the general hardship made communities less tolerant of those who couldn't contribute to collective survival. Thomas had survived multiple winters only because of Margaret's continued protection and the basic shelter provided by the tavern. Spring brought hope and desperation in equal measure. The promise of renewed life and economic activity was tempered by the reality that winter had depleted whatever small resources people like Thomas had managed to accumulate. The gap between survival and starvation was often narrowest in the months before spring planting could begin to address winter's depletion. The medical understanding of Thomas's condition was limited by medieval theories that attributed most illnesses to imbalances in bodily humors or divine punishment for sin. The physical symptoms of chronic alcoholism were recognized, but they were generally seen as inevitable consequences of moral weakness rather than treatable medical conditions. Margaret had accumulated her own practical knowledge about the effects of long-term drinking through years of observation. She could predict when Thomas was approaching a particularly dangerous period based on subtle changes in his behavior and appearance. She had learned to water down his ale when she sensed he was consuming dangerous amounts, and she knew which foods might help counteract some of the physical damage. This informal medical care was probably more effective than anything official medieval medicine could have offered. Margaret's interventions were based on direct observation and trial and error learning, rather than abstract theories about humoral balance or spiritual correction. The village's official medical practitioner, when one was available, showed little interest in treating people like Thomas. Medieval physicians focused on patients who could pay for their services and whose conditions seemed amenable to cure. Chronic conditions associated with moral failure fell outside their professional interests and expertise. Herbal remedies and folk medicines were more accessible to people in Thomas's situation, though their effectiveness was questionable. Various plants were believed to cure excessive drinking or restore damaged livers. But these treatments were expensive and often ineffective. Thomas had tried several such remedies during his more optimistic moments, but none had provided lasting relief. The psychological aspects of Thomas's condition were completely beyond medieval understanding. Concepts like addiction, depression, and anxiety disorders wouldn't be developed for centuries. His suffering was interpreted through moral and spiritual frameworks that provided explanation, but little practical help. Thomas's story was approaching its inevitable conclusion, though he remained unaware of the specific timeline. His body was failing in ways that even Margaret's untrained eye could recognize. His periods of lucidity were becoming shorter and less frequent. His ability to perform even simple tasks was deteriorating steadily. Yet he continued to wake each morning, help Margaret with her preparations, and settle into his corner to begin another day of drinking himself toward oblivion. The routine had become so automatic that it continued even as the physical and mental capabilities that supported it gradually disappeared. The other tavern regulars had begun to treat Thomas with the kind of respectful distance usually reserved for the dying. They no longer expected conversation from him, no longer included him in group activities, no longer bothered to complain about his presence. He was becoming a ghost before he was actually dead. Margaret watched this decline with growing sadness and a sense of helplessness that frustrated her practical nature. She had spent years trying to help Thomas without fundamentally changing his trajectory. Her kindness had probably extended his life, but it hadn't saved him from the consequences of his choices and circumstances. The village as a whole was preparing for Thomas's eventual death in the subtle ways that medieval communities dealt with anticipated losses. People were mentally adjusting to his absence, making alternative arrangements for the small tasks he still performed, and beginning to remember him in past tense even while he remained alive. Father Benedict had begun making discreet inquiries about arrangements for Thomas's eventual burial. The church maintained a small plot for paupers and outcasts, those who died without family or resources to pay for proper funeral rites. It wasn't consecrated ground in the traditional sense, but it was still within the church's protection, a compromise between Christian charity and social respectability. The priest struggled with his own feelings about Thomas's situation. Part of him felt genuine compassion for a man who had clearly suffered beyond his ability to cope. But another part harbored frustration at what seemed like willful self-destruction. a rejection of divine grace and human assistance that challenged Father Benedict's understanding of Christian salvation. These internal conflicts reflected broader medieval tensions about free will, divine predestination, and human responsibility. If God controlled all outcomes, was Thomas's condition part of some greater plan? If humans possessed free will, why couldn't Thomas simply choose sobriety? These theological puzzles had no easy answers, leaving well-meaning people like Father Benedict uncertain about how to respond to suffering that seemed both inevitable and preventable. Thomas himself remained largely unaware of these preparations and philosophical debates swirling around his deteriorating existence. His world had contracted to the immediate sensations of thirst, cold, hunger, and the blessed numbness that ale provided when he could obtain it. Abstract concepts like mortality and meaning had become as distant as the memories of his former life. But sometimes, in brief moments of unexpected clarity, Thomas would experience flashes of understanding about his situation. These episodes terrified him more than his usual confused stupor because they revealed the full extent of what he had lost and how little time remained to change course. During one such moment, sitting alone in the tavern during a quiet afternoon, Thomas found himself studying his reflection in a pool of spilled ale on the wooden table. The face looking back at him was almost unrecognizable. The features were bloated and discolored. The eyes were vacant and unfocused. The expression was slack with resignation. He tried to remember when he had last looked in a proper mirror, but the memory was gone, dissolved like so many others in the constant wash of alcohol. Margaret noticed his unusual stillness and approached cautiously. She had learned to recognize these rare moments when Thomas seemed more present than usual, and she knew they could go either way. Sometimes they led to productive conversations about his health or future. More often, they triggered episodes of despair that could last for days. Thomas looked up at her with an expression of such profound sadness that Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. For just an instant, she glimpsed the intelligent, hopeful young man he had once been, trapped inside the wreckage of what he had become. The recognition was mutual and heartbreaking. "I used to be someone," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "I had plans. I was going to build something, leave something behind. Now I can't even remember what it felt like to hope." Margaret sat down across from him, choosing her words carefully. She had learned that direct encouragement often backfired with Thomas, triggering defensive anger or deeper despair. But she also couldn't let this moment of connection pass without offering some form of human response. "You're still someone," she said quietly. "You're still here, still fighting to get through each day. That takes more strength than most people understand." Thomas shook his head slowly, the movement seeming to cause him physical pain. "Fighting? I gave up fighting years ago. Now I'm just existing, waiting for it to end without having the courage to end it myself." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession that neither quite knew how to handle. Medieval attitudes towards suicide were unforgiving, viewing it as the ultimate sin against God's will. But Margaret had lived long enough to understand that the line between giving up on life and simply enduring unbearable circumstances was often thinner than religious doctrine suggested. "Maybe enduring is its own kind of fighting," she offered. "Maybe staying alive when everything hurts is braver than people think." Thomas considered this for a long moment, his damaged mind struggling to process concepts that required more sustained thought than he usually managed. The effort was visible in his face, like watching someone try to lift a weight that was just beyond their strength. "Sarah used to say I thought too much," he said suddenly, surprising both himself and Margaret with the clarity of the memory. "She said I could find problems in paradise, that I worried about things that might never happen. Maybe she was right. Maybe some people aren't built for happiness." This was the longest coherent statement Margaret had heard from Thomas in months, and she recognized it as potentially his last opportunity to share anything meaningful about his inner experience. She remained silent, hoping he would continue. "I dream about her sometimes," Thomas went on, his voice growing stronger as the memories seemed to feed on themselves. "Not the way she looked when she married the blacksmith's son, the way she looked when we were young, when she believed I could take care of her. In the dreams, I'm still the person she fell in love with. I still have hands that don't shake, eyes that can focus, words that make sense when I speak them." He paused, looking down at his trembling fingers as if seeing them clearly for the first time in years. When I wake up seeing them clearly for the first time in years. When I wake up from those dreams, the disappointment is worse than the hunger, worse than the cold, worse than the fear. Because for a few minutes, I remembered what it felt like to be whole. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. Thomas's pain was so raw and immediate that it seemed to fill the entire tavern, making her aware of her own good fortune in ways that were almost overwhelming. She had never married, had never experienced the kind of romantic love Thomas described, but she had maintained her dignity, her purpose, her place in the community. The contrast made his losses seem even more devastating. "Do you think she ever remembers me?" Thomas asked, looking directly at Margaret with an intensity that was startling after so many months of vacant stares. "Do you think she ever wonders what happened to the boy who promised to love her forever?" The question was impossible to answer honestly without causing more pain. Margaret knew that Sarah, now Sarah the blacksmith's wife, had indeed asked about Thomas over the years, but her inquiries had been the kind that people make about distant acquaintances, tinged more with curiosity than genuine concern. Sarah had moved on, built a life, raised children. Thomas had become a cautionary tale she occasionally referenced when warning her daughters about the importance of marrying stable men. "I think people remember the good times," Margaret said carefully. "I think she remembers the boy you were, the happiness you shared. Those memories don't disappear just because life takes people in different directions." Thomas nodded slowly, seeming to accept this diplomatic response. The intensity was already fading from his eyes, the moment of clarity dissolving back into the familiar haze that protected him from too much reality. "Thank you," he said simply, though Margaret wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking her for. Then he returned his attention to the pool of ale on the table, and the connection was broken. Margaret remained sitting across from him for several more minutes, but Thomas had retreated back into his internal world. The brief glimpse of his former self had been like watching the sun break through storm clouds, beautiful but temporary, highlighting the darkness by contrast. These moments of lucidity became increasingly rare as Thomas's condition worsened. His body was shutting down in stages, each system failing at its own pace, but all moving in the same inevitable direction. His liver, overwhelmed by years of constant alcohol processing, was beginning to fail in ways that manifested as yellowing skin and abdominal swelling. His heart, weakened by poor nutrition and chemical stress, struggled to maintain adequate circulation. His brain, pickled in alcohol and starved of proper nutrients, functioned in an increasingly disconnected way. The village physician, a traveling man who visited every few months to treat paying customers, had examined Thomas at Margaret's request during his last visit. The diagnosis was delivered with medieval directness. Thomas was dying, probably within the year, and there was nothing to be done about it. This news didn't surprise anyone who had been observing Thomas's decline, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly forced the community to confront the reality they had been avoiding. Discussions began, quietly and discreetly, about practical arrangements. Who would be responsible for his body when the time came? What kind of funeral rites, if any, would be appropriate? How should his few possessions be disposed of? Thomas owned almost nothing by this point. His clothes were the same ones he had been wearing for years, patched and repatched, until they were more repair than original material. He possessed a wooden cup that Margaret had given him years earlier, a small knife that he used for eating, and a leather pouch that contained a few coins and some unidentifiable trinkets from his past. But among these meager possessions was one item that revealed something important about the man he had once been. Hidden in the bottom of his pouch, wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth, was a small wooden ring that he had carved years earlier as a practice piece while learning the carpenter's trade. It was crude work, clearly the product of inexperienced hands, but it had been made with love and hope during a time when Thomas believed he had a future worth preparing for. Margaret discovered this ring while helping Thomas organize his possessions during one of his more coherent moments. He had asked her to help him put things in order, a request that seemed to indicate some awareness of his approaching end. When she found the ring, Thomas took it from her hands with surprising gentleness. "I made this for Sarah," he explained, his voice soft with memory. "I was going to make a better one when I got more skilled, but I wanted her to have something from me right away. I never gave it to her, never found the right moment, and then there were no moments left." He held the ring up to the light, turning it slowly to examine the rough carving and uneven surface. Funny how something so small can carry so much weight. I've been carrying this around for 20 years, and I don't even know why anymore. It's not like I'm ever going to see her again. It's not like it matters to anyone except me. Margaret studied the ring with new understanding. This tiny object represented everything Thomas had lost. His skills, his ambitions, his capacity for love, his belief in the future. It was a tangible connection to the person he had been before alcohol, and disappointment had stripped away everything else. "Maybe it matters that it mattered to you," Margaret suggested. "Maybe keeping it all these years was your way of remembering that you were once capable of love, once had something to offer someone else." Thomas considered this, his damaged mind working slowly through the implications. Do you think I should try to get it to her? Before it's too late?" The question revealed both the persistence of hope and the depth of delusion that characterized Thomas's mental state. The idea that he could simply approach Sarah after 20 years of decline and present her with this token from their shared past showed how disconnected he had become from social reality. Margaret chose her response carefully, trying to balance honesty with kindness. "I think Sarah has built a different life now, with different responsibilities. This ring belongs to the time you shared together, but that time is in the past. Maybe the best way to honor what you felt for her is to keep those memories safe inside yourself." Thomas nodded slowly, though whether he truly understood or was simply agreeing to end the conversation was unclear. He wrapped the ring back in its cloth and returned it to his pouch, where it would remain until his death. The approaching end of Thomas's life created ripples throughout the small community that had tolerated his presence for so many years. People began to examine their own relationships with alcohol, their own vulnerabilities to the kind of downward spiral that had claimed him. Parents used his story to warn their children about the dangers of excessive drinking, though they often simplified the narrative in ways that ignored the complex circumstances that had contributed to his fall. Young men who frequented the tavern found themselves wondering whether they were drinking too much, whether their own consumption patterns might eventually lead to Thomas's fate. Some made temporary efforts to moderate their behavior, though most returned to their usual habits once the immediate concern faded. The village's other marginal figures watched Thomas's decline with particular attention, seeing in his fate a preview of their own possible futures. Old Willem began making discreet inquiries about alternative places to spend his final years. Bess the Wanderer started talking about visiting distant relatives who might provide more security than her nomadic lifestyle offered. Margaret found herself grieving for Thomas, even while he still lived, mourning not just his approaching death, but the waste of human potential his life represented. She had seen enough of the world to know that circumstances could push almost anyone toward destruction, and Thomas's story served as a constant reminder of how thin the line was between respectability and ruin. The seasonal rhythms that had structured Thomas's existence for so many years continued around him, even as his ability to participate in them diminished. Harvest time arrived with its usual mixture of celebration and exhaustion, but Thomas was too weak to help with even the simplest tasks. He spent most of the harvest season sitting in his corner of the tavern, watching through clouded eyes as the community marked another successful growing year. The Harvest Festival, traditionally a time of communal joy and thanksgiving, felt different with Thomas so obviously dying in their midst. The celebration continued, but with an undercurrent of awareness about mortality and the fragility of human existence that hadn't been present in previous years. Father Benedict used the Harvest Sermon to address themes of redemption and divine mercy, speaking more directly about the treatment of outcasts and sinners than was his usual custom. The priest's words were clearly influenced by his ongoing struggle to understand Thomas's situation within a framework of Christian theology. God's love extends to all his children, Father Benedict declared from his simple pulpit, including those who have lost their way, those who struggle with demons we cannot see, those who suffer in ways we do not understand. Our duty as Christians is not to judge, but to show compassion, not to condemn, but to offer whatever comfort we can provide. The congregation listened to these words with varying degrees of acceptance. Some nodded in agreement, feeling prompted to examine their own treatment of Thomas and others like him. Others shifted uncomfortably, feeling implicitly criticized for their lack of charity toward people whose problems seemed self-inflicted. Thomas himself was not present for this sermon, being too weak to make the journey from the tavern to the church. But word of the priest's message reached him through Margaret, who had attended the service and felt compelled to share its content. "Father Benedict spoke about you today," Margaret told Thomas as she helped him with his evening meal. "He reminded everyone that we're called to show compassion to those who are suffering, regardless of how they came to suffer." Thomas received this information with little visible reaction, though something flickered in his eyes that might have been gratitude or might have been pain. The distinction between the two emotions had become increasingly blurred as his condition worsened. "Too late for sermons to help me," Thomas mumbled through lips that were increasingly difficult for him to control. "But maybe they'll help the next person who ends up where I am." This comment revealed a level of self-awareness and concern for others that surprised Margaret. Despite everything he had lost, Thomas retained some capacity for thinking beyond his own immediate suffering. The realization made his approaching death seem even more tragic, a waste not just of one life, but of whatever wisdom and compassion he might have shared if circumstances had been different. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the familiar challenges of cold, darkness, and scarcity that made survival more difficult for everyone, but particularly dangerous for people in Thomas's condition. His body had lost the ability to regulate temperature effectively, leaving him constantly cold despite the tavern's fire and whatever extra blankets Margaret could provide. The winter also brought increased isolation, as fewer people ventured out for evening socializing when the weather was harsh. The tavern's atmosphere became quieter, more intimate, with only the most dedicated drinkers braving the cold for their nightly ales. This smaller group of regulars developed a more personal relationship with Thomas's deteriorating condition, watching his decline with the mixture of fascination and dread that comes from witnessing something they knew could happen to them. Christmas preparations began in early December, following traditions that had been maintained in the village for generations. The tavern would serve special holiday ales, stronger and more festive than the daily offerings. There would be singing, storytelling, and the kind of communal celebration that helped people survive the darkest months of the year. Margaret wondered whether Thomas would live to see another Christmas. And if he did, whether he would be coherent enough to participate in any meaningful way. The holiday traditions that had once brought him comfort now seemed to highlight his isolation from the community's shared experiences. But as Christmas approached, something unexpected happened. Thomas began showing signs of increased alertness and engagement, as if the approaching holiday had awakened some dormant part of his consciousness. He started paying attention to the preparations around him, occasionally offering suggestions or memories from previous celebrations. "We used to sing the old songs," Thomas said one evening as Margaret prepared decorations for the tavern. "Before the harvest failed, before everything changed." Sarah had a beautiful voice. She could make even the saddest songs sound like prayers. Margaret encouraged these reminiscences, recognizing them as potentially Thomas's last opportunity to share meaningful memories with another human being. She asked questions about the songs he remembered, the celebrations he had enjoyed, the traditions that had once given structure and meaning to his life. Through these conversations, a picture emerged of the rich community life that had existed before Thomas's fall, and by extension, the depth of what he had lost. The young man, who had once participated fully in village celebrations, who had courted Sarah with songs and promises, who had looked forward to holidays as opportunities for joy and connection, bore little resemblance to the broken figure now dying in the tavern's corner. Yet the memories themselves seemed to provide Thomas with some form of comfort, as if reconnecting with his past self allowed him to remember what it felt like to be fully human. The stories flowed more freely than they had in years, creating a brief window into the person he had been before alcohol became his primary relationship. Margaret found herself treasuring these conversations, not just for Thomas's sake, but for her own. Through his memories, she gained insight into the village's history, the personal relationships that had shaped the community, the dreams and disappointments that had defined an entire generation of young people. She also began to understand more clearly how Thomas's individual tragedy connected to broader patterns of medieval life. The economic instability that had destroyed his livelihood, the limited social safety nets available to people who fell on hard times, the lack of understanding about mental health and addiction, all these factors had combined to create the circumstances that led to his downfall. This broader perspective didn't diminish the personal nature of Thomas's suffering, but it placed his story within a larger context of social and economic forces that affected many people in similar ways. Thomas was both unique in his particular experiences and representative of a class of individuals who had been casualties of medieval life's harsh realities. As Christmas Eve approached, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She would include Thomas in the tavern's holiday celebration, not as a tolerated presence in the corner, but as a recognized member of the community gathering. She announced this intention to her regular customers, making it clear that anyone who objected to Thomas's participation would need to find somewhere else to celebrate. The response was mixed, but generally accepting. Most of the regulars had grown accustomed to Thomas's presence over the years, and the Christmas spirit seemed to make them more willing to extend whatever charity and inclusion they could manage. A few expressed reservations, but none were willing to boycott the celebration over the issue. On Christmas Eve, Margaret helped Thomas clean up as much as possible, providing him with a relatively clean shirt and helping him comb his matted hair. The transformation was limited by his physical condition, but the effort itself seemed to lift his spirits in ways that were visible to anyone who knew him well. As the evening's celebration began, Thomas found himself included in toasts, invited to share in the special holiday ale, and even asked to contribute to the evening's storytelling. His participation was halting and sometimes confused, but the other patrons showed patience and kindness that revealed the better aspects of human nature that sometimes emerge during holy seasons. The highlight of the evening came when Thomas, prompted by the familiar melodies being sung around him, began to sing one of the old songs he had mentioned to Margaret. His voice was weak and uncertain, damaged by years of alcohol and poor health. But the tune was recognizable, and the words came back to him with surprising clarity. The entire tavern fell silent as Thomas sang, not because his performance was particularly beautiful, but because it represented something profound about human resilience and the persistence of memory, even in the face of devastating loss. For those few minutes, the dying drunk in the corner became a vessel for preserving cultural traditions that connected the present community to its past. When the song ended, there was a moment of complete silence before someone began to applaud, slowly at first, and then joined by others, until the entire room was acknowledging Thomas's contribution to their celebration. The applause wasn't patronizing or pitying, but genuine appreciation for a gift that only he could have given them. Thomas himself seemed overwhelmed by the response, tears streaming down his face as he experienced what was probably his first moment of genuine social acceptance in many years. The recognition didn't change his condition or alter his fate, but it provided him with a sense of dignity and human connection that had been missing from his life for far too long. Margaret watched this scene with her own tears, understanding that she was witnessing something both beautiful and heartbreaking. Thomas's moment of inclusion and recognition was also clearly a farewell, a final acknowledgement of his humanity before his approaching death removed him from the community permanently. The Christmas celebration continued around Thomas, but he had retreated back into himself, exhausted by the emotional intensity of being seen and valued by other people. The brief flowering of connection and dignity had taken more energy than his failing body could sustain, and he spent the rest of the evening in a state of peaceful withdrawal. As the other patrons gradually left for their homes and families, Margaret helped Thomas settle into his usual sleeping place. He seemed different somehow, more at peace than she had seen him in years. The Christmas Eve celebration had provided him with something essential that had been missing from his existence, a reminder of his fundamental humanity that no amount of suffering could completely erase. "Thank you," Thomas whispered to Margaret as she covered him with blankets. "For everything, for keeping me alive long enough to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than my own pain." Margaret squeezed his hand gently, unable to speak around the emotion that was closing her throat. She understood that Thomas was saying goodbye, not just to the evening, but to life itself. The Christmas celebration had been his final gift to the community, and their final gift to him. A moment of mutual recognition and shared humanity that would have to serve as his farewell. That night, as Margaret lay in her own bed above the tavern, she listened to the sounds of Thomas's labored breathing from below. The rhythm was irregular and increasingly shallow, suggesting that his body was finally beginning its final surrender to the damage that years of alcohol had inflicted. She found herself praying, not for Thomas's recovery, which was clearly impossible, but for his peace. She prayed that his remaining time would be free from pain, that his death would be gentle, and that somehow his suffering had served some purpose that she couldn't understand, but that might become clear in time. The snow fell quietly outside, covering the village in a blanket of white that would make the world look clean and new on Christmas morning. But inside the tavern, the old year was drawing to a close for Thomas in ways that everyone could see but no one could prevent. As dawn approached, Margaret dozed fitfully, her sleep interrupted by dreams of young men with hope in their eyes and old men with despair in their hearts, of villages that supported their members and communities that forgot their outcasts, of the thin lines that separated salvation from damnation in a world where mercy was often scarce and second chances were rarely offered. The Christmas morning would bring new celebrations and new hopes for the community, but it would also bring them one day closer to saying a final goodbye to Thomas the Ale-soaked, whose story had become intertwined with their own in ways that would outlive his physical presence among them. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made even the heartiest villagers reluctant to venture outside. Margaret woke before dawn, as was her custom, but instead of the usual sounds of Thomas stirring in his corner, she heard only silence. For a moment, Panic gripped her chest as she imagined the worst, but then she caught the faint sound of his breathing, so shallow it was barely perceptible. She dressed quietly and made her way downstairs, where she found Thomas exactly as she had left him the night before. His face had taken on a waxy pallor that she recognized from other deaths she had witnessed over the years. His breathing was irregular, with long pauses that made her wonder each time if the next breath would come at all. Margaret had seen enough people die to know that Thomas was entering his final hours. The Christmas celebration had taken whatever reserves of strength he had remaining, leaving him depleted in ways that his damaged body could no longer compensate for. She settled into a chair beside him, determined that he would not die alone. The morning passed slowly, with Thomas drifting in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he would mumble words that Margaret couldn't quite make out, fragments of conversations with people who existed only in his fading memories. Other times he would lie completely still, so motionless that she would lean close to check for signs of life. Around midday, Father Benedict arrived at the tavern, having heard from other villagers about Thomas's condition. The priest had brought the sacred oils needed for last rites, though he wasn't entirely sure whether Thomas was conscious enough to participate meaningfully in the sacrament. "Has he spoken at all today?" Father Benedict asked quietly, kneeling beside Thomas's makeshift bed. "A few words here and there," Margaret replied. "Mostly names I don't recognize. People from his past, I think. Sarah's name came up several times." "Yes." The priest nodded solemnly and began the ritual preparations for extreme unction. Medieval last rites were simpler than their modern counterparts, focused primarily on confession, absolution, and the anointing with holy oil that was believed to prepare the soul for its journey to the afterlife. As Father Benedict began the familiar Latin prayers, Thomas's eyes opened with surprising clarity. For a moment, he seemed fully present in a way that he hadn't been for months. He looked directly at the priest, then at Margaret, as if seeing them clearly for the first time in years. "Father," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible but surprisingly coherent, "I need to confess something that's been weighing on my soul." Father Benedict leaned closer, prepared to hear whatever sins Thomas felt compelled to reveal before his death. In his experience, dying people often confessed to transgressions that seemed minor to others, but had grown enormous in their own minds through years of guilt and rumination. "I killed him," Thomas said, his words shocking both listeners with their clarity and content. "The boy I used to be, the one who had dreams and plans and believed the world held possibilities. I killed him as surely as if I had put a knife in his chest." Father Benedict exchanged glances with Margaret, both understanding that Thomas was speaking metaphorically about the destruction of his former self, rather than confessing to actual murder. But the anguish in his voice suggested that he experienced this psychological death as a genuine crime requiring forgiveness. "My son," the priest said gently, "the boy you were is not dead. He lives on in the memories of those who knew him, in the love you once felt and gave, in the hope that brought you through each day until hope became impossible to sustain." Thomas shook his head weakly. "I had so much to offer, skills to learn, things to build, love to give. I threw it all away for temporary relief from temporary pain. That boy deserved better than what I became." The confession revealed the depth of Thomas's self-awareness and the extent of his spiritual suffering. He understood exactly what he had lost and felt responsible for losses that had resulted from circumstances largely beyond his control. This combination of insight and self-blame had probably contributed to his downward spiral, creating a cycle where guilt about his condition drove him to drink more, which created more guilt, which required more drinking to numb. "God's mercy extends to all forms of suffering," Father Benedict assured him, "including the suffering we inflict upon ourselves." Your struggles with drink do not diminish the value of the person you were or the love you were capable of feeling. Thomas seemed to find some comfort in these words, though his breathing continued to grow more labored. The effort of speaking coherently was clearly exhausting him, but he appeared determined to use whatever time remained to address the spiritual burden he had been carrying. "Will you pray for the boy I killed?" Thomas asked. "Will you ask God to remember him kindly, even though I couldn't protect him from what I became?" Father Benedict promised to include this intention in his prayers, understanding that Thomas needed to feel that some part of his former self would be mourned and remembered. The priest then completed the last rites, anointing Thomas with holy oil while reciting the traditional prayers for the dying. As the afternoon wore on, other villagers began arriving at the tavern, not for drinking, but to pay their respects to a man who had been part of their community for so many years. Even people who had shown little kindness to Thomas during his life seemed to feel that his approaching death required some form of acknowledgement. Old Willem came, bringing with him a small wooden cross that he placed beside Thomas's bed. Bess the Wanderer arrived with wildflowers she had somehow found, despite the winter weather, creating a small bouquet that added colour to the stark scene. Even some of the village children appeared, wide-eyed and curious about the mystery of death, but maintaining the respectful silence their parents had taught them was appropriate for such occasions. Sarah came too, though she stayed only briefly and spoke to no one. She stood at the edge of the group surrounding Thomas's bed, her face revealing a complex mixture of emotions that might have included grief, guilt, relief, or simple human compassion for suffering. When she left, she placed something small on the table near Thomas's head, though no one could see clearly what it was. After the visitors had gone, Margaret discovered that Sarah had left a small piece of bread, the kind she had been famous for baking during their courtship 20 years earlier. It was a gesture that spoke of remembered affection, forgiveness, or perhaps simply the recognition that their shared past deserved some form of acknowledgement as it finally came to an end. Thomas seemed unaware of most of these visits, drifting deeper into unconsciousness as his body's systems began shutting down. His breathing became increasingly irregular, with longer and longer pauses between each laboured inhalation. Margaret remained beside him, occasionally moistening his lips with water or adjusting his blankets, but mostly just maintaining the vigil that ensured he would not die completely alone. As evening approached, bringing with it the early darkness of winter, Thomas suddenly opened his eyes and looked directly at Margaret with startling intensity. For a moment, his face seemed to clear of the confusion and pain that had marked his features for so many years. "Margaret," he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day, "you saved me. Not from dying, but from dying completely forgotten. You made sure I remained human when everyone else, including myself, had given up on that possibility." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she grasped his hand, surprised by how cold his fingers had become. "You were always worth saving, Thomas. Always worth remembering. Your story matters, even if it didn't end the way anyone hoped it would." Thomas smiled, a genuine expression of peace that transformed his damaged features into something approaching the handsome young man he had once been. "Tell them," he whispered. "Tell the young ones that it's easier to fall than they think, but that falling doesn't mean you stop being worthy of love." These were Thomas's last coherent words. He closed his eyes and seemed to sink into a deep sleep, his breathing becoming so shallow that Margaret had to watch carefully to detect any movement at all. The final hours passed slowly, with Thomas occasionally stirring or murmuring unintelligible words, but never again achieving the clarity he had shown during his farewell. Just before midnight, Thomas's breathing stopped entirely. Margaret waited for several minutes, hoping for one more breath, but none came. The man who had been Thomas the ale-soaked, who had once been a young miller's apprentice with dreams of marriage and prosperity, had finally found the peace that had eluded him for so many years. Margaret closed his eyes gently, and arranged his hands across his chest in the traditional posture of Christian death. She said a brief prayer for his soul, then sat quietly beside his body until dawn, keeping the vigil that medieval custom demanded for the recently deceased. When morning came, word of Thomas's death spread quickly through the village. Father Benedict arrived early to begin preparations for burial, and Margaret began the practical tasks of washing and preparing the body. Medieval death rituals were simpler than those of later periods, focused primarily on ensuring that the deceased received proper Christian burial and that their souls were commended to God's mercy through prayer and ceremony. The village carpenter, a man named Robert who had known Thomas slightly during their youth, volunteered to build a simple coffin without charge. This gesture of charity was not uncommon in medieval communities, where death was so frequent that elaborate funeral preparations were reserved for the wealthy, while ordinary people relied on community support to ensure decent burial for their dead. Thomas's funeral was held 2 days later, on a cold December morning, when the ground was frozen solid and digging the grave required considerable effort. The service was simple but well attended, with more villagers present than anyone had expected. People who had barely acknowledged Thomas during his life seemed compelled to witness his final departure from their community. Father Benedict delivered a brief homily that focused on themes of redemption and divine mercy, carefully avoiding any direct reference to Thomas's drinking, while still addressing the spiritual questions his life and death had raised for the community. The priest spoke about the mystery of human suffering, the dangers of despair, and the Christian obligation to show compassion to those who struggled with problems beyond their ability to solve. Thomas lived among us for many years, Father Benedict said to the assembled mourners. His life was marked by great suffering, much of it self-inflicted, but also by moments of genuine humanity that remind us of our common frailty and our shared need for grace. We commend his soul to God's infinite mercy, trusting that the love and forgiveness he could not find in this world await him in the next. 4. The burial took place in the section of the churchyard reserved for paupers and social outcasts, but Father Benedict made sure that Thomas's grave was properly blessed and marked with a simple wooden cross bearing his name. This small act of dignity meant more to Margaret than she could easily express, ensuring that Thomas would be remembered as a person, rather than simply forgotten as a cautionary tale. After the funeral, life in the village gradually returned to its normal rhythms, but Thomas's death had created subtle changes in how people thought about drinking, community responsibility, and the treatment of social outcasts. Some villagers began showing more kindness to other marginal figures like old Willem and Bess the Wanderer, perhaps recognizing that circumstances could push anyone toward the edges of respectability. The Red Lion Tavern felt different without Thomas's presence in the corner. Margaret found herself looking toward his usual spot throughout each day, expecting to see him there, despite knowing he was gone. The empty space seemed larger than one person should have been able to fill, a reminder of how even the most marginalized individuals become part of a community's fabric in ways that only become apparent after their death.